Aria Bennett took off her apron, folded it carefully, and placed it on the grease-stained counter. The small diner next to the gas station on the edge of town was never busy at lunchtime, but by evening, people started to stream in. She worked the evening shift, from 3 until almost midnight, and every day ended with the smell of oil clinging to her hair, her cheap shirt marked with an old streak of sauce she didn't bother to wash anymore. She lived in a cramped, damp room with thin walls. Every morning she squeezed herself into a packed bus, and every night she walked from the station down a narrow alley lit by a flickering yellow light. But Aria never complained. Not because things were fine, just because she didn't want anyone's pity. At 25, she once thought her life would look very different. She had studied communications at a mid-tier university and had a plan. Graduate, get a job, marry the man she loved, live in a small apartment, and adopt a white cat. Everything seemed within reach, until the truth came crashing down like a boulder from above. They had been together for 5 years. He once took her home for the holidays, once whispered that he'd marry her when they both had steady jobs. But in their final year of college, after his parents went bankrupt, he abruptly pulled away and got engaged to someone else, the daughter of a well-connected business family. It all happened in less than 2 months. Aria didn't even get a proper goodbye. Just a short, cold phone call, a vague apology, and one final text. I didn't have a choice. Aria broke down, not because she lost a relationship, but because she lost faith in herself. She had believed the love she built was strong, real. But it turned out it could be tossed aside as easily as something that had lost its worth. She quit her internship, cut off every mutual friend, blocked all her social media. She withdrew into her shell, quietly, as if she'd never existed in those years before. It wasn't that she'd become bitter. Aria didn't blame anyone, didn't curse the world, didn't resent fate. She just lived, quietly, like a shadow in a crowded city. She took jobs that didn't require much talking, waitressing, folding laundry at a dry cleaner's, sticking labels on boxes. She didn't steal, didn't lie, didn't borrow. She tried to hold on to the one thing she believed she still had, her dignity. But when she looked in the mirror, she could no longer recognize the girl who once smiled brightly in her graduation photos. As she put on light makeup before work, she saw the faint, dark circles under her eyes, her skin dulled from sleepless nights, her calloused hands. On certain nights, staring at the ceiling, she wondered, was she being punished for loving too sincerely? Or for believing in a future she never truly deserved? Sometimes, Aria still walked past the old bookstore near downtown, the one where she used to study for 4 years in college. Through the glass, she saw people laughing, brushing shoulders over steaming lattes, wrapping their arms around each other, as if nothing could ever go wrong. And there she stood outside, in a worn coat and scuffed shoes, like an outsider in her own life. And though she never said it out loud, deep down, Aria believed she didn't belong to the world of people who are loved. To her, happiness was something meant for others, the lucky ones, the beautiful ones, the rich ones, the ones who got to choose. But she never gave up. Every morning, she still went to work. Every time a customer spilled a drink, she still smiled and cleaned it up. Whenever someone asked for help, she still offered her hand. Not because she expected anything in return, but because it was the only way she still felt human. Aria didn't know that this quiet persistence, this gentle, humble way of living, was quietly leading her toward a turning point she could never have imagined. One pause, one act of kindness, and a door that fate was silently opening just ahead. That afternoon, Aria finished her shift earlier than usual. A cold drizzle had begun to fall, not enough for anyone to open an umbrella, but enough to soak through her coat and cling to her skin. She walked briskly along the sidewalk, passing the familiar gas station, cutting through the parking lot, planning to cross the small park toward the bus stop. Her hand tightened slightly around her bag strap, her head lowered as always. No eye contact, no expectations. As she was about to cross a narrow street near the intersection, she froze. An old woman stood by the curb, fumbling with an overstuffed canvas bag, her trembling hand clutching a lamppost for balance. No umbrella, no purse, and no sense of where she was. She looked around, confused, her eyes scanning the faces of people rushing past, but no one stopped. A couple walked by, giving her a brief glance before continuing. A man in a suit passed, earbuds in, not even turning his head. Everything moved like a steady current, no one noticing the frail silver-haired woman standing small and lost amid the city's evening rush. Aria hesitated for a moment. She knew that if she kept walking, no one would blame her. But something in the old woman's eyes made it impossible for her to leave. She turned back, stepped closer, held her umbrella over the woman's head, and gently asked, "Are you all right, ma'am? Are you looking for someone?" The old woman looked at her, her eyes cloudy, yet carrying the depth of someone who had lived through many years. I'm trying to get home," she said softly. "But I got off at the wrong stop, and I can't quite remember the bus number. I also forgot my phone." Her voice trembled, not just from the cold. Aria nodded and guided her to sit on a nearby bench, pulling out her phone to check the bus routes. After a few careful questions, she figured out which neighborhood the woman meant, a place more than 10 stops away, requiring a transfer to another bus. Most people would have called a taxi, but the old woman didn't have a phone, and she clearly didn't use ride-hailing apps. "I'll take you home," Aria said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Oh, no, dear," the woman protested softly, waving her hand. "You must have things to do. My shift's over." "It's okay," Aria smiled, holding the umbrella over them both as she helped the woman cross to the bus stop on the other side of the street. The bus arrived. Aria and the old woman got on together and took seats by the window. The woman was still trembling slightly, but the panic in her eyes had faded. Along the way, she began to talk. Not in any clear order, just fragments of memories. How she once baked apple pies so good that the neighbors begged for the recipe. How she used to live in a house with a flowered porch. How she once had a white cat named Muffin. Aria didn't say much. She just smiled and listened, nodding gently whenever the woman paused to catch her breath. There was something soothing in her voice, as if she was using her own memories to keep herself warm. And for a fleeting moment, Aria felt something deeply familiar, not because of the woman herself, but because of the feeling of being trusted, even just enough for someone to share a small, meaningless story. After nearly an hour, they got off at the last stop. The old woman lived in an aging apartment complex, its walls yellowed with time, the wooden stairs creaking under each step. In front of her door sat a small pot of withered plants and a faded welcome mat that still read, "Welcome." The old woman fumbled with her keys, unlocked the door, then turned to Aria. "Would you like to come in for a cup of tea?" "As a thank you." Aria hesitated for a moment. She wasn't used to stepping into a stranger's home. But the look in the woman's eyes, no longer lost, just quietly hopeful that someone might stay a little while, made her nod. "Just for a bit," she said softly, stepping across the threshold into the small apartment, where the faint scent of cinnamon lingered in the air, and where everything began to shift from one small, unnoticed act of kindness. Aria hadn't planned on coming back. But 3 days later, as she passed a small bakery after work, she stopped by the window, looking at the butter cookies wrapped in paper bags, and thought of the old woman's trembling hands holding that cup of tea. For reasons she couldn't explain, she went inside, bought a small bag, then took the same old bus back to the worn-down apartment building at the end of the street. The old woman opened the door, surprised at first. Then her wrinkled face bloomed into a smile, soft and warm like folds of time itself. "You really came back? I thought you'd forgotten all about that silly little visit." She took the bag of cookies, opened it, inhaled the scent, and chuckled. "This smell reminds me of my old bakery kitchen when I was young." That was the first time Aria heard the old woman say her name. Maribel Foster. She told her she used to be a cook at an elementary school for many years, teaching mischievous kids how to bake chocolate chip cookies without burning them. After retiring, she moved to this city with her husband. But he passed away early, and she'd been living alone ever since. Her family was small, just one grandson she hadn't seen in years. From that day on, Aria started visiting every week. Some days she brought homemade sandwiches. Other times, just a few discounted bags of fruit from the supermarket near her job. She didn't talk much, just helped Mrs. Maribel wipe down the kitchen shelves, replace the moldy window curtains, and fold the pile of old tablecloths. The old woman often told stories from her past, about her time cooking, volunteering to teach baking at the church, even how she once dreamed of opening her own bakery, but never saved up enough to make it happen. One rainy afternoon, while Aria was dusting the bookshelf, she heard Mrs. Maribel's sigh. "You know, dear, I have a grandson. He's doing well, something in education or community work, I can't quite remember. But he's angry with me." Aria paused, turning to look at her. "Why is he angry?" "Oh, it's such an old story," Maribel said with a faint laugh. When his mother died, I said a few things I shouldn't have. I was afraid he'd drown in grief if he held on to it too long. But he thought I was being insensitive, cold. And that was that. No visits, no calls, nothing. Her voice softened. Maybe he's right. Old people like me tend to say foolish things. Aria sat down beside her, still holding the cleaning cloth tightly in her hands. I think no one should have to live with a misunderstanding forever. Maribel smiled, but her eyes seemed to drift somewhere far away. Aria didn't say anything more. Yet those words, meant for the old woman, pierced straight into her own heart. That night, sitting alone in her damp little room, Aria turned on the small lamp, opened a bag of cheap snacks, and thought back to everything that had happened to her. She'd been misunderstood before, had tried to explain, had hoped someone would come back and ask how she really felt. But no one ever did. And eventually, she stopped telling her side of the story. She thought about the man she once loved. 5 years together, and in the end, he remembered her only as an outdated choice. Not good enough, not well off enough, not suitable. Then he disappeared from her life as if he'd never existed at all. She had once cried until her chest ached in her dorm room, written a long letter she never sent, wished she could tell someone just how deeply she'd been hurt. But in the end, she stayed silent. Just like Mrs. Maribel. The only difference was that Maribel grew old within her silence, while Aria carried hers inside, like a thin layer of dust that settled on everything she touched. Aria rested her arms on her knees and stared up at the moldy ceiling, a strange feeling stirring inside her, the kind you get when you understand someone else's wound too well because you've bled from the same place yourself. But this time, instead of pain, she felt calm. Because for the first time in years, she was reconnecting, not with her past, but with a living, breathing person right in front of her. And that, however small, was enough to warm a part of her heart that had been locked away for so long. A week after that rainy afternoon, Aria was stacking soda bottles at the diner when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The photo showed a tray of freshly baked apple pies, with a short note beside it. "Didn't burn this time, kiddo," followed by a smiling emoji. She laughed out loud, even with her nylon gloves still on. She didn't need to guess. It had to be Mrs. Maribel, who had apparently just learned how to send pictures from her phone. Maybe someone in the neighborhood had helped her. The message warmed a small corner of Aria's heart, like a pie just pulled from the oven. The next evening, just as Aria had changed out of her uniform and was about to open her dinner box, her phone rang again. This time, it was another unknown number. She almost didn't pick up. But then a man's voice came through, clear and calm. "Hello, this is Simon Callahan, Maribel Foster's grandson." Aria's grip tightened around her phone, her eyes fixed on the wall in front of her. She hadn't expected that name, the one Mrs. Maribel had mentioned in passing, a sad detail from the past, to suddenly appear so vividly in her present. "My grandmother caught a mild cold," Simon continued. "She asked me to call you, said you visit her often and know her daily routine. I bought her some things, soup, orange juice, medicine, but I'm not sure she'll actually take them." Aria nodded instinctively, as if he could see her through the line. "I'll come by," she said without hesitation. "I just got off work." When Aria arrived, dusk had just settled. The dim lights of the apartment building cast weak patches of yellow across the wooden stairs. She climbed to the familiar third floor, and for the first time, the door was already open. Simon stood there, sleeves rolled up, neatly cut brown hair, his expression composed and polite, like someone fully aware he was stepping into another person's private space. But what caught Aria's attention wasn't his appearance, it was his eyes. They carried something of Mrs. Maribel's in them. Depth, quietness, and a trace of sorrow that didn't need to be spoken aloud. "You must be Aria?" he asked. She nodded and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of mint. Mrs. Maribel was lying under a blanket on the sofa, smiling even though her voice was hoarse. "I told him to call you, dear. I knew you'd get here faster than a nurse." Simon smiled, stepping aside so Aria could set the bag on the table. While she prepared warm water and a towel for compresses, he simply watched, not in a way that intruded, but with the quiet attentiveness of someone relearning what it means to care for another person. After Mrs. Maribel fell asleep, Aria stood to pour herself some water, but Simon reached out. "Let me," he said. She nodded, accepting the glass, and the two of them sat at the edge of the kitchen table in a silence that didn't feel awkward. "My grandmother talks about you all the time," Simon said after a moment. She says a strange young woman showed up out of nowhere and somehow made her laugh again every Wednesday. Aria smiled faintly, taking a sip. She's the only person who still calls me kiddo and gets away with it. From that evening on, Simon started showing up more often, not because anyone asked him to, but because he seemed to need a reason to come back. Every time he visited, he brought something new. A few bags of vegetables, a carton of milk, a fresh hand towel. But he never intruded on the space between Aria and his grandmother. Instead, he listened more than he spoke, occasionally joining their stories, and always stepping back with quiet grace. Aria didn't talk much to Simon at first, but she noticed the way he paid attention, how he always asked if his grandmother had eaten, adjusted the curtain so the sunlight wouldn't hit her eyes, quietly replaced a burnt-out light bulb without mentioning it. There was something about the way he simply was that made her feel safe, not showy, not loud, but deeply respectful. One afternoon, while the three of them sat eating the cookies Mrs. Maribel had baked, Simon looked at Aria and asked, without pretense, "What did you do to make my grandmother trust you so much?" Aria shrugged, her eyes on the plate of cookies. "I just didn't walk away when she needed someone." Simon was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "There was a time I thought I didn't need to come back, but seeing her now, I realize sometimes all people need is someone willing to listen." He reminded me of that. Aria didn't reply right away, but inside something shifted. For the first time in a long while, she no longer felt like an outsider watching other people's lives from the edge. And from that seemingly small twist of fate, a message, a phone call, a mild cold, everything began to change. Quietly, but truly. After countless afternoons spent in Mrs. Maribel's tiny kitchen, the space between Aria and Simon began to close, so naturally that she couldn't quite tell when his gaze had become a familiar part of every visit. Simon never rushed things, never pushed his way into her life. He was simply there, steady, unintrusive, like someone who knew that care didn't need to be loud to be real. One Saturday afternoon, as the three of them were rearranging food containers in the kitchen cabinet, Simon turned to Aria and said, without warning, "Next week, the community center I work with is holding a neighborhood fair on the east side of the city. Are you free?" Aria looked up, momentarily caught off guard. "You want me to come with you?" Simon smiled and shook his head. "Not with me. Just come see it. It's where I work. I think you'll like it. Kind people tend to find each other in places like that." She stayed quiet for a moment. Her first instinct was to say no, as she always did whenever someone invited her to step outside her safe boundaries. But his eyes held no pressure, no expectation. It wasn't a demand, just an invitation, from someone who, somewhere along the way, had become a friend. Aria nodded slightly. "Let me think about it." A few days later, she went with him to the center. It was an old building, renovated, not fancy, but alive with color. Children's drawings on the walls, name tags for volunteers, a bustling community kitchen. She was introduced to a few people. Everyone greeted her with warm smiles, asking not where she studied or what she did before, only, "Which part would you like to help with?" Simon handed her a small stack of papers, a list of families in need of assistance that week. "If you're free," he said, "I thought you might help with notes and scheduling visits. You're good at observing people and understanding them." Aria looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "You really think I can do that?" "I don't have any degree for this," Simon interrupted gently. "You have something most people don't, a genuinely kind heart. You just need a place to see your own worth, Aria." His words left her speechless. Aria soon accepted a part-time position at the community center as a field assistant. At first, it was only a few hours a week, but gradually it became more. She learned how to meet with struggling families, listen to their stories, take notes on their needs, and plan aid distributions. Some days she joined volunteer groups, teaching art to children. Other days she helped prepare meals in the community kitchen. The first time she stood among the laughing kids, sleeves splattered with watercolor, Aria was startled to realize she was smiling. Genuinely, freely. She was no longer the shadow moving quietly through the diner's back room, but someone others could feel close to. She started wearing brighter clothes, tying her hair up, laughing more when she talked. And most importantly, she began to believe she wasn't invisible anymore. One afternoon, after finishing their shift, Simon took the bus home with her as usual. They sat side by side in comfortable silence while the city drifted past, bathed in the soft gold of the setting sun. Simon looked out the window for a moment, then turned to her and asked, his voice gentle as the breeze, "Why do you always leave happiness for everyone else?" Aria didn't answer right away. She tightened her grip on her bag strap, eyes fixed on the floor of the bus. "Because I used to think, if I wasn't good enough, then I didn't have the right to keep happiness for myself." Simon said nothing, but she could feel his gaze, not pitying, not prying, just listening. Aria drew a deep breath. "I once loved someone, deeply. We went to college together. We're together for 5 years. I thought I'd marry him one day. But then, out of nowhere, he said he had to marry someone else, for his family, for his future. She had more, everything. I was replaced. No chance to explain. No one asked how I felt." She paused for a moment. "Since then, I've just tried to live the right way, quietly, without expecting much, without bothering anyone. I thought, if I stayed silent long enough, people would just leave me alone." Simon didn't look away. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging something deeply true. Then he spoke softly, almost as though he were talking to himself. "But there are people who, even without saying a word, still make others want to come closer. You're one of them." And for the first time, Aria didn't feel ashamed of what she'd been through. She felt grateful, because somehow those wounds had led her exactly where she was meant to be, to the right person, at the exact moment her heart was ready to open again. That evening, when Aria shared the story of her past love, Simon didn't interrupt with comforting cliches or hollow advice. He simply stayed quiet, listening. And when the bus finally stopped at the last station, he turned to her and said one sentence that made her chest tighten with something achingly real. "Maybe you just need someone who sees you before you even see yourself." That sentence followed Aria all the way home, threading through every thought, every heartbeat. It wasn't flirtation. It was recognition. A quiet acknowledgement that she had walked through pain and somehow managed to keep the best parts of herself intact. A few weeks later, the community center where she worked held its annual volunteer appreciation ceremony. Aria never once thought her name would be called. She was just there to help set up chairs, pour tea, and help a few kids tape the torn edges of a paper banner. In her mind, everyone else at the center deserved it more. The ones who had volunteered for years, or who had real organizational skills, unlike her, a girl with no fancy degree to her name. But when the event began, the director, a graceful older woman with silver hair glinting under the warm lights, walked up to the stage and smiled down at the front row, where Aria sat quietly. "This year's award isn't for the volunteer with the most hours," she said. "It's for the person who reminds us why we started in the first place, because kindness doesn't need a certificate." Aria's name echoed through the room, carried by a wave of applause. She froze, stunned. A few people nearby nudged her shoulder, smiling in encouragement. Simon, standing in the back with the tech crew, didn't cheer or call out. He just watched her quietly, a small curve on his lips, his eyes full of quiet pride. Aria walked up to the stage, her hands trembling, a shy smile tugging at her mouth. When she accepted the wooden plaque engraved with the words "Heart of the Year," she looked toward the front row and caught Mrs. Maribel's warm gaze. The old woman sat up straight, her hands clasped together, tears rolling down her cheeks, but her smile was radiant. Aria lifted the plaque, and for the first time in her life, she felt seen. Not because she'd done something grand, but because she had simply lived as herself. When the ceremony ended, Aria searched for Simon among the crowd packing up chairs and cables. He didn't say congratulations or offer praise. Instead, he held out a folded tissue with a small grin. "My grandmother's been crying all night," he said softly. "I'm pretty sure it's because she's proud." The next day, Simon texted her, saying he wanted to meet. "Nothing serious," he wrote. "There's just something my grandmother asked me to do." That afternoon, he drove her to the southern suburbs, where tall oak trees lined both sides of the road, their branches weaving shadows across the pavement. The car stopped in front of a small, cream-colored house with a white fence and bougainvillea climbing around the windows. It looked simple, warm, like every breath inside it carried the memory of a lifetime. Simon turned to her, his voice soft. "This was my grandmother's house. She asked me to bring you here. She said, if anyone could make her laugh again after all these years, that person deserves to be in this place." Aria stared at him, wide-eyed. "You're joking, right? I can't possibly accept this." Simon shook his head. "I'm just doing what she asked. She made it clear. It's not repayment. It's a gift." She believes this house needs someone who knows how to keep it warm. Aria stepped out of the car and walked slowly around the porch. The wooden door still carried the faint scent of pine resin, and the steps showed patches of worn paint. Everything bore the marks of time, yet it all stood strong. She placed her hand on the doorframe, feeling the lingering warmth, as if the house still held traces of the laughter that once filled it. Turning back, her eyes stung. "I can't, Simon. I have nothing to give in return." "She doesn't want you to give anything," he said softly. "She just wants you to accept it." When they returned, Mrs. Maribel was already sitting on the sofa, as though she'd known exactly how Aria would react. She looked up, her eyes gentle, her voice frail but steady. "You helped me live again, Aria. I used to think my final years were just waiting for time to pass. But then you came, and I realized I could still love, still trust someone again. If you truly care for me, then live the rest of your life with the same heart you used to reach mine." Aria sat down and took the old woman's hand. That frail hand trembled, yet held hers tightly. She couldn't find any words, only nodded as tears fell onto both their hands. In that small room, with the evening light spilling softly through the window, Aria understood that sometimes life's greatest rewards don't come from what we fight to earn, but from what we give without even realizing, and receive back as grace. She didn't know what the future would hold, but in that moment, she knew one thing for certain. Fate had finally seen her, in the gentlest way possible. Aria moved into the little house on a Monday morning, just as the sun was drying the last drops of dew on the porch roof. Not because she wanted to own something that belonged to someone else, nor for any material reason, but because, for the first time in her life, she felt truly welcomed. Not as someone who came after, not as an outsider, but as a natural part of that place, as if she had always been meant to belong there. The house didn't have much of material value, but every little corner carried warmth. The scent of aged wood, the soft creak of a cabinet hinge, the neatly folded handkerchief still tucked inside a drawer. All of it made Aria feel as though she were being embraced by something unseen. Simon helped her move in, just a few small bags, an old bookshelf, and a handful of clothes. He didn't ask many questions, didn't suggest how she should arrange anything. He simply stood beside her as she opened the door, as if to say, "If you need someone beside you, I'm here." They didn't talk much about whatever this was. No one tried to name what was quietly taking shape between them. Instead, they cooked together on weekends, handed out food during the holidays, and celebrated their first Christmas in that little house, with a tree Aria decorated herself, using old ribbons and paper ornaments the kids at the center had made. Simon never rushed her, never made some grand romantic confession like in the stories people tell. Instead, he simply stayed, through all the ordinary moments. Waiting for the bus with her in the rain, fixing the creaky back door, helping her find the route to her first soft skills class. Then one spring morning, when cherry blossoms began to drift across the park paths, Simon took Aria for a walk. The sunlight spilled gold over the lake, and the breeze carried the softness of unspoken things. They walked slowly along the stone path, shoulders brushing now and then as they stepped around puddles. Simon stopped, hands in his pockets. After a quiet moment, he turned and gently took her hand. "You don't have to answer right now," he said, his voice calm but steady. "I just want you to know, if there ever comes a day when you're ready to believe you deserve to be loved, then let me be there. Not to save you, but to walk beside you." Aria didn't say anything. She looked down at her hand resting gently in his, and then she began to cry, not out of surprise, nor from some cinematic rush of emotion, but because for the first time someone had spoken aloud the truth her heart had buried for years. "You deserve to be loved too." She didn't rush to answer. But from that day on, she started to talk more about herself, about her rough childhood, her fear of being left behind, the many times she'd stood on the edges of other people's lives. She stopped hiding, and Simon listened, with his eyes, with his quiet presence, with questions that never pressured her, and with silences that fit perfectly between her words. As time passed, Aria slowly became someone new, not because anyone changed her, but because she finally began to believe she had the right to change her own life. She enrolled in evening classes on community management. Soon after, she began proposing new projects for the center, one of them called Listening to Youth, a program that connected young people with lonely seniors. During one of those intergenerational dialogues, a little girl raised her hand and asked, "Have you ever felt like you didn't belong anywhere?" Aria looked up, met the child's eyes, and smiled. "I used to think that," she said softly. "But I've learned, you don't have to be a perfect piece to fit in. You just have to be a kind one." That sentence was later shared in a social media post. Not long after, a local newspaper wrote about her, not as some modern-day fairy tale, but as a living example of the quiet power behind one simple choice: stopping for a stranger. In that little house, Aria built a new life day by day. Warm dinners at the kitchen table, quiet mornings reading by the window, lazy afternoons walking her bike through tree-lined streets. Mrs. Maribel was still healthy, visiting now and then with freshly baked pastries and her signature witty remarks. Simon was still there too, patient as ever, sometimes holding her hand, sometimes simply walking beside her. No rush, no demands. And Aria, the girl who once lived quietly above a small diner, could now look at herself in the mirror, shoulders straight, eyes unafraid, lips curved in a gentle smile. Not because everything was perfect, but because she knew. She had lived kindly, loved without calculation, and chosen the right moment to stop and listen to an old woman in the rain. And fate, like an old friend who had been watching from afar, finally stepped forward in that moment, placing in her hands the greatest gift of all, a true love, and a life fully, authentically her own.